time at the moment, but just to introduce Professor Casper Bruun Jensen. And thank you for coming. I met Casper for the first time in about 2018, was it? And around that time we began talking about education futures and futures in general. He visited us in 2019 to give a presentation on speculations. And this time we're very happy to have him back, talking about sustainable futures and with particular regard to cities. And I think that's enough for me. Very good as well. And let's go. Maybe I'll just
Okay, thank you very much. I guess you can hear me easily with no microphone, right? I don't need to. Okay, thanks you, and thanks for showing up in the basement room. And yeah, I think there's a connection between what we were beginning to do like 4 years ago, thinking about. I mean, I'm not an education person, as it will say on the next slide here. I'm from science and technology studies, or the anthropology of science and technology, so it's quite different from education research in some senses. But you and I got, I guess, together around an interest in thinking about futures, in particular futures relating to the many different and diverse kinds of climatic and environmental and sort of nature-oriented challenges that are facing us today. Like obviously I'm part of higher education institutions myself, so I'm also interested in figuring out like what is it, somebody out there? What is it, welcome. What is it the younger generations, in a way, ought to learn something about while we have floods and fires and hurricanes and so on? Is the situation the same as it was 50 years ago or 150 years ago, when sort of philosophers were debating things, or you had different kinds of struggles and problems, issues of knowledge emerging? Was it different? I mean, I think the situation is changing quite rapidly around us, and the big institutions, we have political institutions as well as educational institutions, are not typically geared to quick changes. That's why they're big institutions. They are sort of long-lasting, durable, and slowly changing things. So in situations of sort of great upheavals, in a sense, you have a mismatch of times almost, where certain kinds of things need to happen quite quickly, but we are not very good at having them change very quickly with the big systems we have. So these are the kinds of things I began thinking about for myself, and also with others, and also with Ewan back then. And I mean, then one of the things that changed extremely quickly was COVID at the time. So then it became impossible to do anything, and obviously to visit here for years. And now we're sort of trying to pick up the pieces of that collaboration again. And so back then it was about speculation, and I think I was saying back in 2019, there's a kind of emerging sense that a lot of the social science theories, also maybe natural science, but let's stick with what I know something about it, social science theories that have been with us for many years, that no longer seem as compelling as they used to. We're no longer so convinced that the concepts, ideas, or even methods we have had for many years are suitable for the changing times, but we're not sure what we need instead. And so that when we were discussing speculations, it was in part searching for things, ideas, ways of thinking in literature or the arts or indigenous knowledge systems or other places that might help make our ways of theorizing and acting as academics more lively and more compelling. So for example, Marx was a great analyst of a great many social, capitalistic and so on situations, but Marx didn't live in the Anthropocene where things are changing the way they are now. He just didn't, so he was not a prophet. Or Bourdieu, or the other white men like Foucault, or like the non-white men, or like how could they, right? We need we need new ways of thinking a changing world. So that's it. But today I won't talk about speculation. It's just to say that sits in the background too. But the framing is clear enough. everything I'll be talking about concerns global environmental, not changed, but changes the question of breached planetary boundaries. I've just written disasters left and right and put some pictures because you all know what it is we're talking about. And if I'm not mistaken, Hong Kong was surprisingly wet not long ago, right? I mean, and so infrastructures are very troubled. In Denmark, it was the same not long ago. You had people almost drowning in their cars, unthinkable 10 years ago, and now it's like the systems are not up to speed. Many people are trying to deal with that in many different ways all around us. But my particular take on that will be that I'll try to think aloud with you here is about what a way of thinking about sustainable futures from the point of view, I said, of anthropology of science and technology, and what I'll call practices of world making. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And with a specific focus on cities, which is in part because I'm interested in urban anthropology these days, and in part because Hong Kong is such a curious city. I mean, there are many reasons why it's a curious city, but I'll talk about some specific ways. It's curious because it's operated as a model for thinking about the challenges of climate change or environmental and ecological damage for 50 years, which you may or may not know. So I'll talk about it with particular reference to the challenges of thinking about cities. And then I'm going to sort of weave back and make some remarks about what I think that teaches us. Not specifically about what you or anybody else absolutely must do, but what I think are some of the parameters we have to think through. I need to say one more thing here. What changing roles for higher education institutions? What I mean by that, I think, is two different things. And since I'm not the education expert, I'll in a way leave that up to you guys. But I had in mind a sort of double sense of change or responsibility. On the one hand, you could say a sort of material or natural sense, that is the huge energy-consuming and wasteful institutions in themselves that use energy, aircon, badly insulated materials, and are very costly and inefficient in many ways. Like, there's the material surroundings simply require a lot of work, I think. But then in terms of that's the form, in a way, of the university. But in terms of the content, that would be my main interest here, the reconfiguration of the content of the university. That is, the knowledgeable subjects or citizens that come out, and the other side, what is it they need to know that they didn't need to know before? What is it that has to change that we need to be able to think about together and learn stuff about together? That's what it is about. And one key word here, the bridge to the next one, then was futuring. I think, in brief, universities and many other institutions need to, and so I apologize for the overloaded sort of text, but it's for distribution afterwards. If you're interested, then you'll have it for reference. Futuring is a term that comes from the Australian designer and design thinker called Tony Fry, who's been very taken with the problem of what it means to design things in a way that isn't destructive of the planet, but in fact ensures its livability in the longer run. And he has a sort of long-winded and semi-philosophical way of expressing himself, but if we do it, and by that he means if we sort of manage to future-proof the planet, it can only be by design against the still accelerating defuturing condition of unsustainability. And why is unsustainability defuturing? In his view, it's because defuturing design is any kind of design that relies on material flows that cannot be replenished, which means that in a certain sense, yeah, I mean, what would be a good example, I guess, would be a good example. Planned obsolescence would be a good, that these devices here are built literally to break down, so we'll have to buy new ones. But what's inside them are various flows of materials metals and stuff, for example, from African mines, where people die in the mines to get various kinds of things that we need here and use for 2 or 3 years, and then we must throw them away because they're built to break down. I mean, that's defuturing. It eats up the materials in the ground. It also eats up human lives. They cannot be replenished, and it foreshortens the livability of the planet each time we do that. So he's interested in diagnosing the types of designs we surround ourselves with that defutures us, that eats our future in the now, like gives us something in the now but eats the future in the shorter or longer run, and encourages a really deep rethinking of like, what would it mean to design material artifacts or social and economic systems where we would not defuture ourselves. I mean, so it's going to be fine for me and you and maybe for some of you, but like for one generation down, it'll be less and less fine. So there's an acceleration of defuturing going on. And so the big question is how to stop it. And so he has his descriptions here, like where he centers on the perspectival limitation of human-centeredness, which means, especially the Western tendency to, over the last centuries, to have treated the planet simply as an infinite resource at our disposal, which is now, a view, the limitations of which have become extremely visible. And so futuring then means, he says, giving the self, the embodied mind, acting in the world a future, giving the self and the collective of selves. And he defines that in 2 ways: the care of the person itself, which is not an educational issue primarily, I think, but secondly, the care of the conditions of being that allows for something to go on flourishing rather than being defutured. So I think the problem is how to make sure that universities teach students what are the problems with defuturing and the necessities of future in brief, and that can be many things. Now, I want to go into cities as a kind of mini case study without any of you needing to know much about cities per se. But I want to discuss the question of futuring and defuturing from the point of view of the city, because we're in Hong Kong and because cities in general have a lot of problems. Not Hong Kong, but cities in general. And because cities in general also cause a lot of problems for non-cities, namely all the hinterlands that provide the food resources, mining materials, and everything that flows in so we can consume continuously and enjoy ourselves. So there's a duality there. There's a lot of problems in the cities, and the cities cause a lot of problems. And that has to do with futuring and defuturing. Now, so here we run into some of the interesting issues, I would say, and problems that then face us, because one can ask, well, how to deal with such a thing as such an enormous and complex thing as a city. What is a city actually, and what to do with a city analytically in terms of futuring and defuturing. And the problem I'm going to point out here has to do with what I will call dualistic models of thinking about cities that tend to split their problems into 2 very different kinds, some that belong to humans and culture, and some that have to do with material flows and nature. And this is an educational issue per se, because that maps how we teach things here. Namely, there's a natural science and there's a social science, and we are in some in the humanities. And anyway, and there's something chemists and engineers do, and there are other things religious scholars and sociologists do. So we split our domains into 2 different sides and pretend that they're separable. Now, in fact, they're not separable, and that's part of why we're not very good at thinking about future. So I just want to show you this is an ancient one. It doesn't have, but it's a typical one. I think it's an ancient night schemata from urban areas as mapped by a guy doing Chicago in the 30s. And it's the social side of the dualism. I mean, And we have here the loop. I don't know if you guys know how Chicago looks. No, it doesn't matter. But you have a transition zone with a lot of, I guess, offices and stuff. Then you have a zone of working men's homes, so they can easily get into the zone where they work. And then you have residential zones, like suburbia further out. And then he's done a little bit more here with commuting and some other things, and a ghetto, and indeed a Chinatown, very much in the interior here, and a little Sicily, so in Italian, sort of split up. And what we see here is that this is an easy to understand mapping in a way, and I think you could easily do something similar with Hong Kong if you wanted. And then you would say that Hong Kong and Kowloon has a lot of Chinese people, and back in the colonial days, the peak had only very white English people. And so there's a separation of things that can be mapped on in purely human terms here also. And so that's, of course, this is very simplistic, but it exemplifies a social mapping of a space. No? And now a lot of text here again. I just want to show you, because this is where Hong Kong actually came into being as a model for thinking about urban issues back in the early 60s, in terms of urban metabolism. And the idea here is this is the human. This is going to be the non-human, or the material side of the dualism, the other half, so to speak. So what we have here was an industrial engineering type researcher. He argued that, he argued many things, but I think the key thing, here we have Victoria, Hong Kong Island from Victoria Harbour with a lot of smog, I think. He was interested in mapping the inputs and outputs of urban settlements, transportation networks, the capacity of their natural and man-made circulatory systems, and the resources and disposals. In other words, the flows of materials. And the reason why Hong Kong was great for doing this was in order to figure out whether cities were sustainable. Like literally, how much comes in and how much goes out of the city. How much, what can we see here? How much coal, charcoal, aviation gas, many other things, and other figures. You have like corn, iron, zinc, nickel. If you could do that in analogy with how it's done for thinking about the human body, the metabolism of the human body, then you'd be able to evaluate whether that is sustainable. This was before you said sustainable. But he said back then in '63, I think it was, over the next 25 years, 73. These cities, I thought I had a number, but it's like, here it is. Over the next 25 years, this number of what will be needed to operate the cities of the world will increase fivefold. That's going to cause a lot of problems, he concluded from his Hong Kong study. Now, the reason why Hong Kong was such a good study area for him was because Hong Kong had the specific capacity that the boundary of the city mapped onto a boundary of a city-state, like Singapore would have worked similarly, I think. Whereas if you're thinking about Copenhagen or New York or Edinburgh, it's difficult to sort of cleanly separate what comes in and comes out because the boundaries are fuzzy. But when the city boundary and the state boundary, in a way, are very clearly controlled, so you have harbors here and then you have a mainland boundary, it was easy to quantify these flows. And that's why Hong Kong could operate as a sort of, in analogy with the body, in a different, in a more effective manner, and enable this kind of very strong quantitative argument, which since then gave rise to a very rich literature within engineering and industrial engineering and urban planning and so on the urban metabolism and the problem of the sort of disproportion between the use and disposal of resources and the problems that's gonna is projected to cause, and which it is in fact causing today. And it must also be said that urban metabolism has been picked up in many other domains today, far outside the engineering fields, for example in cultural geography and in some parts of anthropology. Marxist-oriented cultural geographers have picked up this idea of urban metabolism in order to think about what they call uneven geographies of consumption and disposal and so on. That's less sort of super quantitative than this one, but nevertheless, what I want you to take here, and again, I'm not saying this is bad, like I wasn't saying the other thing is bad. I think this is highly interesting and good in some ways, but what we see is material flows, right? Everything here is a material flow. I'll show you a couple more pictures of how they just visualized it. So before that we had zones with people, and here we have material flows. So you have two versions, human and non-human, cultural and natural. Now let's look at this one here, which I downloaded and skimmed through recently. That's the vision for Hong Kong 2030. Here we have a different situation, which in a certain sense, in a certain sense, like this man here, Neural, I think was his name, was proven right. I mean, there's going to be all these problems because we consume, that means you or the previous people there, consume all this stuff in Hong Kong, and it's not going to work out in the long run. You really need to think about it. We really need to become familiar with the metabolism of our cities, unless we did not become sufficiently familiar with those metabolisms. And therefore, today, Hong Kong has many things to think about in terms of its metabolisms and its livability. And this is according to the official report here. What is it Hong Kong faces over the next 6 years? It's the need to be able to create sustainable growth. How to do it? It's a matter of creating a smart, green and resilient city in a general context which Hong Kong hasn't quite made itself. It has been widely recognized that the Earth is getting warmer. Yeah, that's safe to say. Climate change is a global challenge for everybody and also for Hong Kong here. And then there's something that's specific to Hong Kong here: limited land and resources, aging building stock, and infrastructures, such as infrastructures that were not geared to the amount of waters that are not now coming down, which means that things flood and so on and so forth. And then there are a number of some suggestions, obviously not bad suggestions, and minimize demand for and use of land resources because there aren't so many of them. Optimize low carbon living, via building designs, the more sort of abstract, and I don't think it has that much content, but capitalize on technology in general without much specificity. Please be smartly mobile, and water management is a good idea. And then you have some keywords that are roughly, I think, resembling keywords you get in other of these types of reports across the globe. Minimization of use, mitigation of risks, adaptation to new conditions, and being resilient. That is, you know, the general catch-all terms for everything, like be resilient to change. You have to deal with a lot of mess now. It's COVID, now it's the next time. But collectively we'll be resilient, and then we'll somehow deal with it. It's a little bit. So I think when I read this, first of all, I think this kind of report and the recommendations, again, I mean, people are doing whatever they can with the resources they have available. But it seems clear to me that this is much on the side of technological innovation and engineering and planning. That is, it sticks mainly to the material and natural side of things, and not to sort of the combination, the non-dualistic combination of people, humans and non-humans, nature and culture together. There's a lot of hope invested in technological solutions and engineering in this, and not much on other things. I will also say, and this is my interpretation, but this is not particularly about Hong Kong's 2030 report. This is about many reports all over the world. In my personal opinion, there's something of a mismatch or incongruence between the sort of relatively loose and meager ideas that are packaged in a very pretty and aesthetically pleasing manner, and then the actually really serious problems that cities are going to deal with over the next 15 years. We don't have to talk about Hong Kong. It's not about saying anything in particular about this city. We can talk about Bangkok, where I live now, where I think it's more or less acknowledged by serious people that Bangkok is sinking. There's a good chance that much of it won't be, you can't live there well, maybe in 30 years. And then what do people do? I mean, they have a couple of workshops and they say smart mobility and capitalize on technology, but nobody has a clue what to do about it. Because it's a wicked problem, it's not manageable, and it's politically dead to say we need to move Bangkok, we need to move the capital of Thailand somewhere else. You can't. If you sort of try to platform yourself on that, your career is finished, and yet it keeps sinking. Yeah? And I feel like, so again, similar here, I feel like there's a mismatch. Yeah, you can, this, what does it mean? Is that really going to address the very rapid changes that are going on here? Is this the best that it's possible to imagine? And of course, I mean, as I said, there's also the packaging of this in relatively standardized language, which is striking, that if you read reports from Singapore, Stockholm, or Rio de Janeiro, or sub-Saharan Africa, they all say minimization, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, and capitalize on technology. So there's a kind of a standardized package of language that is fine, okay, you can use these terms, but doesn't really capture the specificity of problems that have to do with, like, what's going to happen in Sha Tin, what's the situation here, like, what's going to happen with the coastal communities over there or inland here. This cannot per definition be dealt with in this kind of macroscopic problem and vision. Now, so that's, I would say, sort of empirical and policy comments one might make about this. But now, since I promised I would be talking about educational challenges, then I'm going to try to take a quick step back and extract some more general, a couple more general issues that I find in this. The first is, I've already mentioned in terms of how I presented the cities, is, yeah, that the way of separating out the problems. So you have problems with, as I showed on the first slide, the zoning of different kinds of people, and then the flows of different kinds of materials. That creates a sort of a division of labor that's very clear-cut and nice in terms of imagining what people need to learn, but doesn't really match reality where these things are mixed together in various ways. In fact, there are many people across many disciplines now that are also arguing that this kind of dualism of separating man, as they say, or let's say man and woman from the environment, or nature from culture, so on, is in fact part of the problem that has propelled us into the Anthropocene, climate change and so on, because the separation makes us people think that we can freely and with abandon use everything over on this side because it's only the environment. It's not what we live together with, it's something that's at our disposal. So it turns all of this over here into extractive resources we can take. Yeah? And so there's both a sort of conceptual issue with this, and there's maybe a consequence of that is that it's actually helping to accelerate the destruction we're in. Now, in the literature today, you then often see alternatives. So this is not something new or special I'm inventing, where people will say, well, actually, we now understand, and therefore we also need to teach that we live in social ecological systems. Social and ecological, these are integrated things, they're not separable. That means that our habits as people that live in collectives, social collectives and so on, are fundamentally tied together with the resources, the lands we have, the earth we breathe, and so on. And you need sort of to have an understanding of that inseparability. And then you can end up with something that combines various ways, like here. Now, this figure has biophysical structures of society, so it encourages a way of thinking where the biophysics lies underneath society and sort of determines and structures what we were able to do. I think one could also do it the other way around and saying there's social-cultural structures of nature. And by that I would mean that, for example, different religious systems or different indigenous ways of thinking about what it means in an environment, for example, in African countries, Southeast Asian countries, probably in Europe in old days and so on, were not premised on the idea of a clear separation where you would just take whatever you used. It was premised on, for example, there being spirits in the trees or in the waters, and you need to pay respect in various kinds of ways through rituals and in other ways, which made you less likely to just chop down everything and turn it into iPhones, if you will. So you can talk about biophysical structures of society, but also different social ways of imagining what it means to be in the world, social and religious and so on. And it doesn't really matter one way or another. The point is that it's not separable, that it is, in language that is often used today, entangled or hybrid or knotted or reciprocal, or in more systemic language, like coupled together. Okay, so then we have an aspect of the future here. Let's see, I only have, what do I have? Where can I? All right. I'm also going to, there's one other conceptual bit I wanted to touch on here. This is the dualism. I also wanted to touch, since we were talking about Hong Kong as a city, as a special kind of city. The reason why Hong Kong was a special kind of city and of special appeal from the point of view of thinking about urban metabolisms was that you could sort of imagine it as a body because it had clear boundaries, contrary to many others like Denmark, for example. No, not Denmark, Copenhagen or others with more fuzzy boundaries. And that was very effective in terms of enabling that mode of thinking of urban metabolism. But it of course also has a problem, which is that in many ways those boundaries aren't actually that clear, despite being drawn on paper and despite being there in text and treatises. So for example, for much of Hong Kong and the new territories history, people actually walked back and forth across the boundaries, so it wasn't that clear. It wasn't totally clear. And of course, animals did so too. And of course, even more important, other things move very clearly and don't care at all, for example, water or air. You can make as many clear boundaries, but if you sort of put it in 3D and create a time series, then you'll have air. It moves around and it's not going to care. So in some sense, the strength of this creating the fixed boundary body that was Hong Kong also turns out to be a limitation and when it comes to thinking about other sorts of problems. And yeah, so, and this is where I will now go into the sort of final area here and try to come up with something different, again with an enormous amount of text. For example, air and water, as I said. Now, one of the things that is really interesting for escaping nature-culture dualism and for being able to think about entanglements of various kinds that have emerged in recent years is an idea that has come from the ecological and geological sciences primarily, but drifted into some areas of social science and humanities, and that's called critical zones. And I changed my title here on the first slide to say education in the critical zone. Because for me, it's a bit new, but very, very interesting to think about the kinds of challenges I've sort of alluded to in terms of critical zones. And now I'm just going to first say, or repeat what I put on the slide here, what a critical zone is from the point of view of the scientists that came up with the term. It's basically a column that goes up in the air and down in the ground onto the groundwater. So it's sort of thin layer or film that's surrounding us, and they refer to it also as the fragile skin of the living, or slices of existence. And very poetic, even in philosophical terms, slices of existence. The reason why they put this kind of column together as a critical zone is because almost all living things live not higher than the upper atmosphere and not lower than the groundwater tables, because it becomes it's hard for most organisms. Yeah? And conversely, what it is that makes critical zones the space of living for the rest of us, mammals and insects and so on, is that lots and lots of things are going on in an entangled manner in those zones. So originally they were like geochemists and seismologists and ecologists and hydrologists that were not specialists in, they were specialists in their own things, but they kept running into boundary problems where they couldn't solve the problems except by learning something about geochemistry despite being a water person, or learning something about biology despite being a seismologist and so on. So they started building critical zone observatories with tons of different equipment on the prairies and deserts and up in the mountains and so on, and measuring a lot of stuff that I don't understand terribly well. But measuring basically in order to figure out what are the kinds of flows and gradients and thresholds that mean that certain trees or certain crops or certain mammals or rodents or whatever keep living, and when will they get into a critical condition. I mean, so that's the second term for sort of a critical zone. Is critical in that it's critical for our living, but also critical because many of them are in a critical condition. Many of the flows that sustain us are becoming more and more unstable, and so these guys are trying to figure out why that is. But in the social science and the humanities, there's also critical zone research, and it's primarily been exhibited in a huge volume called Critical Zones, the politics and the science and politics of landing on Earth, I think it's called. An enormous catalog. It's also a very beautiful book. I encourage you to take a look at it, where you have representatives for all kinds of social science and humanities, mainly European, that are exploring the implications of this idea of slices of existence for our domains that are usually more human-centered. And Bruno Latour, the famous social scientist that just died last year, he defines critical zones as a kind of, as triggering a triple feeling of disorientation. It raises questions that require different answers from what social scientists have usually delivered in terms of where are we in space, where are we located? Yeah, we are in Hong Kong, but what are we related to when we're in Hong Kong? What kind of period do we find ourselves in? And in identity, who are we? Are we? What sort of agency do we possess? And what does that mean now that we're faced with what they, as many others, define as a sort of existential crisis, a matter of life and death, because our critical zones or slices of existence are becoming more and more unstable. And I like this little little thing here, like what does it mean? I mean, it's a big discussion. Maybe we have a few moments to talk about it. But in identity, who are we? What sort of agency do we possess? And then, what does that even mean? Who are we? Then Latour here will say, well, who are your partners? Maybe you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a dog, your family, that's your partners. But are you involving the land that allows you to live among your partners that you're working together with? And if you do, to which extent? Do you take into consideration the flows that allow the plants to live, or the soil that is depleted or not depleted by whatever you're doing, so that the mode of analysis of the relations that allow us to thrive changes completely depending on how you extend your understanding of the zone you live in. So for example, like, are you sure you did not forget earthworms? Are they your partners in living? Maybe they are, you just haven't thought about it yet. How would you react if you were told that it takes 100,000 years for soil to be regenerated, and by some estimates there are only 40 years left before it is depleted? And then some that I think is great for a lot of the sort of cultural and political discussions that are here and elsewhere. It's one thing to celebrate your roots and quite another to learn from botany. And I think that perfectly exemplifies this kind of non-dualist thinking. Yes, you have your roots, and of course yours and mine are different, and it's important to deal with, but there's so many other roots that need to be taken into consideration if you want to have a livable world. I think that has very much to do with questions of future and de-futuring.